This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 120 of Here's How for the 13th of May 2021. The Social Democrats are maybe the wokest party that we have in Ireland, but how sound is their reasoning? Let's find out from one of their prominent new TDs.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Coming up in a few minutes.
But one thing that I don't think helps is, for example, conversations like this where it's saying, oh, look, women just aren't as good at sports. And look, they just they're not as good at performing. They're not the Ariana Grande
No,
of
that's not what I was saying, but
hockey
anyway.
Or badminton.
That's coming up shortly. But first, I want to thank all of my donors on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who does that. If you don't know, Patreon is a system that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, and that helps me to devote more time to research and to finding interesting guests. If you think that you could do the same as them, there's details on the website and at the end of the show. I try to steer away from jargon on this podcast, but I've got 2 jargon words to give you here. The words are mop and bog off. Before I tell you what they mean, let me apologise for the background noise. I'm not in my usual little back bedroom improvised studio at the moment. I've managed to get away, so I'm complying with all the COVID regulations by self-isolating by the seaside, on a small Greek island. Good weather, nice beaches, small taverns, cheap wine. Try not to be jealous. But maybe you should be a bit jealous of the cheap wine. That brings me to MUP, which stands for Minimum Unit Pricing, the unit in question being a unit of alcohol. The Cabinet recently signed off on proposals to bring in minimum unit pricing from next January so that there will be a floor price below which alcohol can't be sold to consumers. Because alcohol is much dearer in pubs, when we have pubs, this really just affects off-licences and supermarkets that sell wine, beer and spirits. The idea has been knocking around for a while. It first came to prominence in Ireland in the 2011 Fine Gael manifesto. I'll read you what they said verbatim. Supporting Irish pubs. Fine Gael recognises the importance of the Irish pub for tourism, rural jobs and as a social outlet in communities across the country. We will support the local pub by banning the practice of below-cost selling on alcohol, particularly by large supermarkets, and the impact this has had on alcohol consumption and the viability of pubs. The viability of pubs. So it was clear that this was a measure to support the viability of one business at the expense of another. Publicans who make vast profits have huge political power. Quite a few TDs are publicans themselves. Industry sources that I've talked to say that pubs typically make a gross margin of 50% or more on the drink that they sell. If any other industry had that type of margin, there would be a rush by entrepreneurs to get into that market to cash in on those profits, and that competition would bring down prices and profit margins. But there is no rush of competition for publicans, because they use their political muscle to get the government to make it illegal for you or me to open a pub. You need a licence. The number of licences is strictly controlled. If you want one, you have to pay probably millions to buy one off someone who already has one. It's a classic government-enforced cartel. The effects of this cartel are pretty obvious to anyone who has spent time at a Mediterranean resort. Like pubs in popular locations in Ireland, the bars in Greece, Spain and so on often hire staff to stand outside the door to interact with potential customers. The difference is that on the continent, they hold out menus, talk up the fare on offer, bring people in, find them a table and so on. Their job is to get people into the pub. In Ireland, the job of the door staff is to keep people out. Think about that for a minute. What other business is in a position to hire staff to keep potential customers away? And think about what those continental door staff are doing for a moment. Offering food, making sure people find seating and so on. The food in Irish pubs has improved in recent decades, but there are still plenty of places that offer nothing or next to nothing other than alcohol. This is a totally standardised product. It's almost impossible to go wrong. Restaurants are subject to the whims of taste and fashion and go in and out of business at regular intervals. Pubs, by contrast, can do the same thing year in, year out, making huge profits as they go, guarantee that nobody can come and compete with their business. So they have plenty of time and money to devote to political lobbying to make sure that their little gold mines aren't interfered with. The only fly in the ointment for them was that they were making so much profit that their customers were increasingly staying at home and having friends around for a few drinks bought much cheaper in a supermarket or off-licence. That was the context of Fine Gael's 2011 promise to recognise the importance of the Irish pub, as they put it, by restricting competition from off-licences and supermarkets. This didn't really go anywhere because, despite pressure from the publicans, there wasn't really any evidence that much of the alcohol sold was sold below cost. These guys are in business to make a buck too. But that protectionist measure has now come back like a zombie in the guise of a well-intentioned social reform, supposedly to reduce alcoholism, setting a minimum price below which alcohol cannot be sold. A similar law is already in place in Scotland, but the minimum price per unit of alcohol there is set at 50 pence sterling, the equivalent of 57 euro cent. The Irish level is being set at €1 per unit, almost double the Scottish price. Just in case you are wondering, this is not a tax. All of that price increase goes straight to the retailers and producers of alcohol. And the price hikes are going to be pretty steep. The minimum price, the lowest possible legal price for a bottle of wine, will be about €7.50. The lowest possible price for a can of beer will be about €1.70. To put that in context, I went into a supermarket where I'm staying in Greece the other day. There were cans of beer for 69 cents, bottles of cheap Greek wine for 99 cents, and plenty of other wine choices for under €2. Prices in Ireland are already far higher than that, and come next January, they'll be much higher still. So the question is, does that lower price lead Greece to have more alcoholism than Ireland? No. Even with the current pricing structure, where Ireland has some of the most expensive drink in the world, we're very close to the top of the World League in alcohol consumption. According to the World Health Organization, there are only 6 countries on earth where people consume more alcohol than us. We drink well over double the global average. Mediterranean countries where alcohol is dirt cheap come way down the table. Greece is at 34, Italy 48. Now, I don't want to say that there is no evidence that price has any impact on alcohol consumption. There is. In Finland, they had very high alcohol prices, but cut them sharply in 2005 in anticipation of Estonia joining the EU and making cheap booze just a short ferry ride away. There was a noticeable increase in alcohol-related harm, such as admissions to accident and emergency wards. There have been studies on this. The minimum pricing in Scotland also seems to have had some effect in the opposite direction, but it's not clear yet whether in either case this is a cultural shift or a short-term effect, and whether the previous patterns will reassert themselves. It's plausible that this will have some effect on young people drinking. Price can be a real barrier for them. But it's naive to assume that this would have much impact either on alcoholics or even on occasional binge drinkers. Price just doesn't seem to be a barrier for them. But one thing is that, as far as I can see, all of the research is on whether or not the MUP will reduce the problem of alcohol overconsumption in Ireland. Nobody is studying whether it could make the situation worse. Very basic economics imagines that there's a straight line relationship between price and consumption. That's often true, but not always. There are examples of what are called inelastic markets. That's to say that however high the price goes, people will pay it. A good example of this is booze for an alcoholic. They will pay what it takes to get their fix. But there are also examples of markets where, when the price goes up, people buy more. This is counterintuitive, but humans aren't always rational. One example of this is diamonds, which the marketeers have managed to persuade people are some sort of age-old tradition. But they really only became a popular option for engagement rings since the Second World War. And a key part of the marketing strategy was to massively increase the price, making people feel that the product must be important because it's so expensive. This is a great trick if you can get away with it. People buy more because you're charging them more. Not just jewellery, it also works with cars, some food items, particularly luxury foods. Would anyone really want oysters if they were 99 cents for a 10-pack in Aldi? And there's evidence that this works with alcohol. Now, the real giveaway that this is a protectionist measure that has nothing to do with public health is that the price is not being increased by a tax. It's being increased by outlawing price competition. All of that extra that you will pay goes straight to the retailers and suppliers. They will be coining it. The worst possible thing that could happen for them is that they have slightly reduced sales rewarded with massively increased profit margins. But I'm not at all sure that their sales will be depressed for long. In modern marketing, aside from higher prices sometimes actually stimulating higher sales, retailers have a whole host of devious ways to trick us into buying more than we actually want. That brings me to bog off. Bog off stands for buy one, get one free. If you look around your local supermarket, you will notice that you don't see 50 or whatever % off anymore on many products. Instead, you will much more often see buy one, get one free. That's objectively a worse deal for consumers. You have to buy 2 products to get the discount. But the retailers have worked out that consumers subconsciously saw the lowering of price as a signal that it was a lower quality product. The same thing, but phrased differently with the requirement to buy 2 units, buy one, get one free, shifts far more units and makes far more profits. Now that retailers will have much bigger profits, they will also have the cash and the motivation to work out devious marketing tricks to persuade people to buy more booze. It might take them a while, but with such huge profits to be made and a guarantee that nobody can undercut them on price, you can be sure that they will work it out. I doubt if this measure will do much for alcoholism in the long term, but you can be certain that it will create another entrenched, politically protected cartel, and that's not a good thing.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On the line now, I have Holly Cairns. She is the Social Democrat spokesperson on agriculture, food and the marine, and further and higher education and disability. You get a lot of portfolios when you're in a small party. She's also a TD for Cork South West. I think the only one of two left-wing TDs in Cork South West in that constituency since the 1970s, and she's the only one of 18 TDs. She's the only female in the whole of Cork City and County. Holly, you got into politics, and I think it's fair to say it's pretty obvious that you have a social justice and a gender equality agenda. Do you think that you're a good poster child for that?
I suppose, being the only female TD in Cork, you kind of become a poster child for gender equality. But I mean, it's a privilege to be able to do it. And I'm glad we have at least one female TD. Another way of looking at it is that there's actually 6 times more Michaels representing Cork than there is women. And then obviously 17 times more men. But yeah, I mean, it's quite stark. And, going into politics, my main motivations would have been around social justice issues. So, for example, I was quite politically motivated by marriage equality and repeal. But the kind of motivation to continue was around climate change and the need for climate action, and particularly in relation to agriculture, because I grew up on a farm and I studied that. But since getting elected, so much of the work that I'm doing seems to be in relation to women's rights and women's issues. And, I think it's safe to say that I probably get a lot of representations in relation to those issues. So, you don't necessarily end up working on what you expect to work on, but I've really enjoyed it. And like I said, I'm very delighted to work on all of these women's issues, although it wasn't how I first saw things going.
And Holly, do you accept the benefit of the antagonistic democratic setup that we have and most Western democracies have, that opposition parties, people who oppose you, really improve your ideas because they're picking holes and you're trying to improve your ideas to defend yourself against that, and vice versa?
Yeah, I think, the role of a public representative is, it's integral, it's completely fundamental to listen and to be open to understanding new things that perhaps you didn't in the past. So yeah, absolutely. And I mean, most of your time spent as a public representative is listening and engaging with your communities. But of course, it's not exclusive to that. You have to listen to everybody and all the different beliefs to really make informed decisions and form informed positions on certain issues. So absolutely, I think it's very important. And I think it's a shame that the way the Dáil works is that government routinely vote down anything that the opposition brings forward, because it doesn't actually make any practical sense. Opposition TDs represent their constituents in different parts of the country and all of those things. So to kind of blanket ignore those, I think, is the wrong approach, and it's a real shame.
Okay. And then my follow-up question to that really is, one of the things that you've promoted is gender equality. I think it's probably fair to say that although there might be some subterranean opposition to that, there's no real, let's say, within the Overton window, there's no permitted opposition to that. No politician is willing to stand up and criticise moves towards gender equality. Do you think that there's a danger then that perhaps bad ideas can get through because they're not being picked apart?
I think that, when you think about, I think there's that expression, in times of oppression, when you sit on the fencey side with the oppressor. And you're right, nobody will object or speak out against a move towards better equality for gender, for disability, for anything. However, doing nothing is almost just as bad. And that's what we've seen from this government and successive governments, that there's just an inaction. And really and truly, that is the cause of the ongoing inequality we see in gender, of course, and that stands out because it's actually over 50% of the population. But then in so many other areas as well, we see it with the travelling community, with people with disabilities, with people in direct provision. The list goes on, but it's the inaction is really the problem. And because you're right, nobody will come out and speak against it. I remember when I first got elected and raising the gender pay gap with the Taoiseach, because I think it's the 9th of November. From there on in, women kind of work for free for the rest of the year. And him just kind of saying, yeah, I agree. And something really needs to be done about that. And he was kind of scratching his head saying, I don't know why it is that guards are paid more than nurses. It must be that old breadwinning model. and kind of
Okay,
scratching his
pause
head.
pause on that, because you said this, and you said women, and you tweeted out this as well, actually on November the 9th, saying that women are working for free for the end of the year. Are you sure that's true? Can you give me just step through very briefly the logic on that?
I don't have the breakdown of figures in front of me, but I certainly had them at the time.
Sure, but the logic, we don't need to get into the weeds of the, what percent or the numbers or whatever, but just step me through the logic of it.
Just based on how much women earn comparatively to men, when you break that down, they were essentially working for free for the rest of the year from the 9th of November. Which is kind of a stark, horrifying figure.
Pause on that, because I've been looking through the figures for researching this, and I don't expect anybody to have the figures at their fingertips, but I think the logic of this is important. And you as a TD, for example, who was elected, let's say, on the same day as a male TD, will be paid, I'm correct, exactly the same. If you are elected under the same circumstances and been serving for the same amount of time, to the cent, you're paid the same. That's true, isn't it?
That is true, but in terms of pay transparency...
That's true in like a whole wide range of public sector jobs, where there's actually a published schedule of pay for different grades and different lengths of service and so forth.
Yes, absolutely. In loads of jobs, that's very transparent and very clear. But in other companies and industries and fields, that's not clear at all. So one of the things we need to do is to introduce the pay transparency legislation as promised by the Programme for Government. And then I think if there was an obligation for companies to carry out audits in relation to, how gender disparity, pay disparity is playing out in their companies, that's something that would really help address the gender pay gap, amongst loads of other things.
Okay, pause.
Transparency is very clear in relation to public
Holly, pause. You've used two different terms there: gender pay gap and gender earnings gap. Which are we talking about?
Gender pay gap.
Okay. And as I said, you as a TD, we all know your salary. At least we can look it up because it's published information to a certain degree, perhaps not to exactly the same degree, but most people in the public sector, they have the same situation. So, are you claiming, because I want to understand what you're saying exactly, are you claiming that in the rest of the economy generates an average pay gap, such that on average people in the economy as a whole are, as you put it, women working for free from November 9th onwards?
Yes, I'm saying that we could amend the Equality Act to extend powers of the Workplace Commission to review, to require employers to conduct an equal pay audit. That is something that would help.
Okay. That would be an audit, and that would find out some information. But would you? And you're on record as looking for legislation. Is that the limit of what you're looking for, or do you have other demands?
I do. I think I briefly mentioned it there, but to introduce the pay transparency legislation as promised in the Programme for Government. To bring forward legislation in response to problems caused by increased casualisation of work, and to strengthen the regulation of precarious work, and that would benefit men and women. I suppose to expand and support the civil legal aid scheme, so we could provide free legal representation to persons taking claims under the Employment Equality and Equal Status legislation. And I suppose one of the really fundamental things, like the absolute elephant in the room in relation to equal pay, is childcare. So often, like, we just know that caring responsibilities tend to fall more on women. And I know from loads of correspondence from constituents, and it could be in relation to housing, but it goes back into this problem, is that it's actually cheaper for one parent to leave their job and stay at home and look after the kids than for the family to pay for childcare.
Sure.
And so often that is the woman then who ends up leaving their role because, for example, breastfeeding and different things like that. And it just seems to be the tendency. It's in our culture, it's in our society. If we had, a fully functioning state provision for childcare, I think we'd see less of that happening and more women being able to stay in the workforce.
Okay.
Loads of different aspects
pause on that, because I suspect that on a huge range of the issues that you campaign on, I'd agree with you. And it probably wouldn't make a very entertaining podcast for anybody if we were just to sit here and agree with each other. But I want to tease out the ideas. And on this podcast, we have an intelligent listenership, and they're able to understand the issues. And that's why I want to kind of tease out this issue. Because there's a controversy here. And on one side of that, there's a claim that essentially women, for discriminatory reasons, are being paid less to do the same work. And on the other side, and looking at the statistics, it seems to me that it's way more complex than that. Are you willing to accept that the level of discrimination here, the level of pay difference that is attributable to discrimination, is either very low or negligible?
I wouldn't necessarily agree with you on that. Now, I just know from people's personal stories, and I don't want to name names, but people working in, in media, in loads of different places, when going for a job that perhaps a male counterpart has left, being offered a lower wage.
Because
I'm that's why it's very important that the pay.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Eurostat figures here, and there's the first thing that you notice is that there's loads of different figures, and the danger with that is that when there's loads of different figures, people can always find one that agrees with them and they can highlight that. But just to focus on one particular difference, there would be a salary difference between men and women and an hourly wage gap between men and women. And the salary difference is much, much bigger. And that's explained by the fact that men, and we're dealing only here with full-time employees, that male full-time employees tend to work considerably more than female full-time employees. That's quite striking, isn't it?
Do you mean they work more hours when they're in full-time work? Or what do you mean by they work more?
Yes, it is that males work approximately 1 hour per day, 5 hours a week, more than women in full-time jobs.
I'd like to see the study myself before commenting on it, but perhaps it ties back to what we were just speaking about home care responsibilities.
Sure, I'm sure it does. Yeah, I'm sure it does, because
more on women.
Yeah, and that women have quite justifiably other priorities. And the other striking thing that I see here is that almost all of the gender pay gap is for people over 40. For anybody up to 39, there is no statistically significant gap between male and female wages. There's something happening there, isn't there?
Well, also, like you refer to, full-time work and there being no evidence there, but like a lot of the time women are the ones working in part-time work. In hospitality,
yes, and part-time work is very. That's true. And part-time work is very difficult to study for this, because you don't know how much part-time work is part-time work, and you don't know how much the person is selecting to work more or less hours. So the easier thing to compare, and it's possibly we're stuck in this paradigm, but the easier thing to compare is men in full-time jobs versus women in full-time jobs. And there's no pay gap at all, nothing statistically significant for people under 40. And 14%, which is the figure that you tweeted and highlighted. That's a true figure. And that is adjusted for hours worked and levels of experience. But it's not adjusted for the issue that essentially men work harder. And it's not really hard to see why, if an employee is working an hour longer every day, why they're likely to be the one that gets the promotion, is it?
Well, for one, just because it's easier to compare data for full-time workers or whatever, it doesn't mean that it's then the most accurate reading of the data. Do you know?
Yeah.
And so there is definitely some nuances there that I don't think are being accounted for.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think a lot of research also shows that it's not just down to, for example, somebody working an extra hour a week, that the gender pay gap and related pay gaps are social and economic issues that need to be addressed, that it's, they're experienced most acutely by older women, is what a lot of the findings will be, for example, from SIP2 and women from ethnic minorities and women with disabilities.
Yeah.
And sectoral kind of segregation is a cause of gender pay gap, with the overrepresentation of women in relatively low-paying sectors such as care and education, and an overrepresentation of men in better paid sectors like technology and engineering. Okay, and there's also
Holly, pause. Yeah. There's also an overrepresentation of men in jobs that are dangerous. Is it justified to pay people more when they're essentially risking their lives?
Yeah, and I wish we had applied that to nurses during the pandemic.
Pause on that, because I've looked up the most dangerous occupations, and the fatality rate in occupations is very closely aligned to the percent of male workers. So, for example, this is American figures from the Bureau of Labour Stats in the United States, or the European figures are largely similar. The 5 most dangerous jobs are being a lumberjack, being a fisherman, being an aircraft pilot, being a roofer working on roofs, and refuse collectors. All of those jobs are overwhelmingly male. It's fairly reasonable to say that if you work in a dirty, filthy, dangerous outdoor job, you're going to get paid more, because if you don't pay more, then you won't get the workers.
Absolutely, I agree that something like, risk to life and stuff, there should be a realization that it deserves pay based on that. 100%, I agree with you. I also think responsibility in your job is an important one. That the more responsibility you have, the more you should be paid. And that kind of risk of life thing that you're speaking about, I just 100% agree with that. If there's a risk to your life at work, I think that has to be considered in your paycheck. Absolutely.
Okay, but pause, Holly, pause. You were referring to the 14% pay gap. And that is adjusted for the more hours that men work. But it's not adjusted for that. So, for example, people who work for Irish Water, down sewerage, pipelines and so forth, that's a pretty unpleasant job. And it is overwhelmingly male. Fishermen, one point I saw an objection to saying fishermen, but 99.9% of fishing workers are men, and it is a ludicrously dangerous job. It's about 60 times more likely to get you killed than the average job. Isn't it possible that 14% that you're referring to has nothing to do with discrimination? It's just down to the fact that men and women choose different types of jobs.
No, I don't believe that it's because men and women choose different kinds of jobs that we have such a gender pay gap in this country. I think the factors that you're talking about play into it, but it's not like people in the fishing sector are the ones raking it in. So I don't think it's the best example to use. There's lots of fishing in my constituency, and the vast majority of fishing families are the small kind of inshore fisheries, and they're not cleaning up the cash. So that's not where we're seeing the imbalance in pay. And I absolutely think that people, for example, in the fishing industry should be recognised for that risk that they take and paid accordingly. And then similarly, when you think of the responsibility that, for example, a nurse has, you've got people's lives in your hands every day, I think they should be paid for that too. And where is the reasoning in, guards being paid more than nurses? Both have responsibility. But I don't think you could say that being a guard is harder work or that there's more responsibility. And yet that is the reality. And they're two state-provided jobs where we see a very obvious discrepancy.
Hold on. Are you jumping back from the particular to the general back and forward? So first of all, by the way, I kind of agree with you on the guards thing. I suspect that the Gardaí are paid very, very substantial salaries for reasons that are entirely different to gender equality, that they're being paid to be loyal to the state and essentially not to question authority. But I don't want to go down that particular road. But the question I asked you earlier on was, there does seem to be some level of just poor thinking in this, and in particular, if we see that, and I don't want to go, to a very small profession like being a fisherman, but across wide, most people, working in an office or working in some other place, if you have one employee who will stay late as long as it takes to get the job done, and you have another employee, perhaps for very good reasons, who's typically a woman, will say, no, sorry, I have to be there to pick up my kids. You can say that perhaps that's something wrong with society in general, but it's very difficult to say that when the guy who stays late every time it's needed gets the promotion, it's very difficult to say that he is being, that's a result of discrimination.
Yeah, and I'd like to see where you've gotten that information in relation to men doing longer hours. I haven't seen that particular study.
It's Eurostat. It's the actual figures you were referring to. It's also the source of your figure of the 14% earnings difference.
So you accept this aspect of it, but not the 14% difference in earnings aspect of it.
I accept that the 14%.
And this is
I accept that the 14%
sorry, just to
is different.
interject. I know you keep telling me to stop talking, but just for 1 second.
Go ahead.
In fairness, people in hospitality, for example, because they're mainly working part-time, they're not taken into consideration in these studies.
Yep.
And the vast majority of people employed in hospitality are women. And I can tell you from working most of my life in hospitality, that you very often end up staying late, doing extra hours, doing all of those things. I find it very difficult to believe that it is men doing more of that than women. I think that it's probably just the sectors that are being looked at. This full-time employment in these industries, they are predominantly filled with men, and then more part-time and precarious work is, more often filled with female employees. So these stats aren't necessarily truly representative of how much overtime people are doing.
Okay. Then let me play you this clip briefly and we'll talk about it.
And I've helped win 4 World Cup championships and 4 Olympic gold medals for the United States. And I've been told that I don't deserve any more than less because I am a woman. You see, despite all the wins, I'm still paid less than men who do the same job that I do. For each trophy, of which there are many, and for each win, for each tie, and for each time that we play, it's less. And I know there are millions of people who are marginalized by gender, and I and my teammates are here for them. We know what it means when people kneel to kneel with them. We know what it means when people stand and cheer, and we know what it's like to be in a full stadium. Thousands and thousands of people who chant together all at once at our moment of greatest triumph, equal pay, equal pay.
And that's Megan Rapinoe. She's, I think, the captain of the US women's soccer team. And she took a very high-profile case for equal pay with the men's soccer team. That seems to be a bit insane to me. Soccer players are essentially performers. Their job is to sell baked beans by getting people to watch the ads in between the soccer games. That's a very poor level of argument, isn't it?
Which aspect of it is a poor level of argument?
Well, the argument that because she trains and plays the same number of soccer matches as a male soccer player, she should get the same salary.
Why shouldn't she?
Well, if I know a few people who can pick up a guitar and play or whatever, and maybe some of them might be good enough to fill a local dance hall or fill Vicar Street in Dublin or some other venue in Cork, would they expect to be paid the same as Ariana Grande for filling a massive stadium?
Oh, sorry. So you're saying she should get paid less because she's less skilled?
No. I'm saying that her job is to sell baked beans, is to essentially get sell advertising on to the audience. Women's soccer has a vastly smaller audience. And I suspect that many players, for example, male players in the League of Ireland, train and play just as hard as many people in the Premier League or whatever other major soccer leagues there are around the world. But they get paid an awful lot less because they are performers and they're performing to far fewer people.
Okay, so, well, yeah, you're kind of comparing like with like for half of it and not with the other half.
Where's the not like with like?
For example, well, it's not like with like in terms of, so you're talking about how many tins of beans will you sell or how many tickets to the game will you sell?
Yeah.
And yes, I completely recognise and understand that less tickets sell for women's sports. But it's not like with like because for forever since sports have been founded, more funding has been directed at male sports. So that needs to change, and that goes down to wages for Olympians as much as it does, funding for advertising, for trying to get people into games. Like, we obviously have a cultural and societal issue around how we view women in sport versus men. Mm-hmm. And we know that's because historically sports have been very dominated by men. But again, that's something that just has to change. We don't go, well, that's the way it's always been, so that's the way we accept it.
No, I'm not suggesting
people can't see themselves a career. Like, you think about a young girl in school and they want to be a professional soccer player. Do we want them to go, oh, well, there's no real career for me in that because there is no professional women's GA team or whatever.
What if she wants to be a
so I just won't bother. We have to change things from the top down.
What if she wants to be a professional badminton player?
You can't just tell me to hold on every time you ask me a question.
Go on.
So you can't expect then for this to happen from the bottom up, basically what you're suggesting is that women should continue to defy the odds to try and make space for themselves in sports, rather than trying to level the playing field, and the pun is intended, whereby women could go into a career in sports just as easily. Because there was an ad, I don't know if you saw it, of women's Irish football team playing a match uphill. And I think that does a really good job of a visual image of what it's actually like, for example, for women in sports, but of course in loads of other industries, that you're constantly up against it, And so if we have an incredible female Olympian, for example, Sonia O'Sullivan, probably the most impressive Irish Olympian ever, but she probably had to work so much harder. And then from what you're saying, from that clip that you played of the woman in the Olympics in the US, perhaps didn't get paid as much. Like, where is the sense in that?
Okay, well, hold on for a second.
Just because historically it's been like that.
What if somebody...
You don't say...
Okay, allow me to ask the question then, since I allowed you to continue earlier. What if the ambition then is not to play soccer, but it's to play badminton?
What if the ambition is to play badminton? I still don't think that women should have to, from the bottom up, try and defy the odds all the time to try and make a career for themselves.
Okay, but somebody playing badminton, somebody playing badminton will be paid vastly less because that's a way less popular sport. Is that a discrimination?
Oh, sorry, but you're saying badminton versus soccer now, rather than a woman in badminton or a man in badminton.
Exactly.
I suppose you could look at it that way, and I think it's just a very kind of argumentative point to make that's probably quite irrelevant, and you could bring that into loads of things, and perhaps I agree with it, but it's a whole other discussion. Like you spoke about people working in the fishing sector earlier, should they be paid a basic minimum wage like Gardaí? Like, it's a whole other conversation that sounds like you're probably just using a point like that to try and discredit an argument.
I'm absolutely not, and I would advise you not to put words in my mouth.
When we're comparing like with like, when we're comparing a female playing badminton and a male playing badminton, I don't believe that the man should be paid more. And I understand the reality of male sports selling more tickets, but how do we expect to ever address that if we continue doing it? It can't come from the bottom up, where we expect women to defy the odds when they're stacked up against them. It has to come from the top down, where we level the playing field and allow women to have equal opportunity in sport.
Okay, and I'm not exactly sure what equal opportunity in sport would look like if it's not men playing against women, which does happen in some sports, but physically that's not a good idea in most sports. But it seems to me that the quality of that argument is just terrible, because sports people at a high level are essentially performers. And if some minor male artist, let's say, could fill a minor venue, he would be in no position to complain that Ariana Grande or some Beyonce gets paid millions to fill an enormous stadium, because they're performers and they're paid based on how they perform. And the judgment of the performance is in the eye of the audience.
So they perform based on how they're paid. That you say they're
paid based on how they perform. Yeah.
But people also, but also people perform based on how they're funded. So if you compare a female GAA team to a male one, of course the male teams are coming out on top because they've got all this funding going into their training. So you can't
they're not playing against each other,
so I'm not sure. Like that without looking.
No,
you get paid for performing this well. But however, loads more funding has gone into you being able to perform that well.
Oh, but hold on for a second. The performance, and by the way, no amount of money, all the money in the world wouldn't be enough to pay to get me to perform at nearly any of those levels, male or female. But my point is that the performance is in the eye, the quality of the performance is in the eye of the audience. And if the audience judges that they want to see this singer and not that singer, or this sports person and not that sports person, then that's within their gift, isn't it?
In the eye of the audience, who are met with a performer who has either had lots of funding putting into training for that performance, or very little funding put into the training for their performance. That's the difference.
And it's okay. So to boil this down, and I want to understand.
So the audience are being met with two different performers. One has been, supported and funded to become a good performer, and the other one hasn't.
So then, to understand your position, that I want to understand you clearly, and contradict me if I'm getting it wrong, you're saying that the public interest in, let's say, women's soccer or women's Gaelic football or whatever would be equal if the public funding of those sports were equal?
I think that's a very important aspect of it, but not the only one. So I think it would start like that. I think it should start from the top down rather than the bottom up. So if we put equal funding into them, then I think people would become more engaged with them. That cultural and societal problem that we have where we view men more as sports people than we do women, I think that would change as a result. But in order to make that change, it has to start with a systematic change within the industries.
Okay. By the way, I
Absolutely.
completely agree with you that at an amateur level, we should have good quality funding and so forth for males and females right across the way, because that brings huge benefits in terms of society and participation and so forth. Completely agree with you on that. But
do you also agree that if one gender is funded more throughout their training than the other, that the less funded one might not be, in the eye of the audience, as you put it, as good of a performer?
I think that up to very recently, up to like a couple of decades ago, the amount of funding that went into things like soccer in Britain and Gaelic football and hurling in Ireland was a minuscule fraction of what it is now, and there was massive interest. So there doesn't seem to me to be a very close correlation between, for example, government funding and public interest. And that may or may not change. So, you might be able to stoke more interest by putting government funding into it. But in the past, when there was little or no funding, there was still massive interest in elite sports. Let's say the All Ireland finals, or as it was, First Division finals in the UK. But I don't want to argue those exact points out with you. What I want to really just ask you about is whether you think that maybe sometimes there are less quality arguments that because they're not challenged, and because most male and female politicians are smart enough not to put the sexist point, that your point of view for promoting gender equality is sometimes maybe not as good as it should be, because you're not being challenged hard on those points.
As in, you think that people have a quiet belief that the points that I'm making are incorrect, but they don't want to challenge me on it?
No, I don't. I don't know. I absolutely don't accuse you or anybody with you of dishonesty. But when you have competition, be it in the commercial sphere or in the political sphere, that causes everybody to up their game. When we had back in the days of Telecom Air, and it cost 50 or 60 pence as it was a minute to telephone Britain. Now we can talk around the world more or less for free because there's competition. And when you have an area of politics that doesn't have that competitive antagonistic tension, the quality of the arguments may not be as good.
I think that most people understand basic reality and facts. And when you look at women's rights in Ireland, say as an example, it's very clear that there hasn't been equality. And, that's very clear from, for example, my grandmother, who I was talking to yesterday. It's not that long ago that she was young and getting married, and she had to give up her job when she got married, changed her surname and lost her PPS number. She wasn't allowed to work.
Yeah.
And we've come a long way from there, but it's not that long ago. So we're still coming out of that type of oppression. And I think that everybody recognises that. And you made reference, for example, to me being the only female TD in all of Cork City and County. Yeah. And I think, we know that women's sports is far behind. We know that women aren't played on the air as much. So I think that everybody understands the basic reality. And I think that is the reason why nobody is massively arguing with this point, because everybody knows that it is true.
Oh, yeah, I agree with you on that. I think you're absolutely correct on that. That's why nobody is arguing on it. But I think that's why sometimes the quality of the detail of the argument, the very fine-grained detail. But just to roll back, as you say, you are the one female out of 18 TDs in Cork City and County. Whose fault is that?
Do you want me to pick a person, or what do you mean? Whose fault is that? I mean, this is such a broad issue.
I would have said,
whose fault is that?
I would have said it's the electorate's fault.
So going back as far as when my grandmother was getting married, this is you can blame the electorate if you want. We have a society and a culture that needs to change.
Yeah.
And in order to change that, we can make systematic changes to try and, egg that on.
Yeah.
And that's where things like, gender quotas come in, and everybody gets up in heaps if they're so controversial. But like, there are loads of things we can do. But one thing that I don't think helps is, for example, conversations like this where it's saying, oh, look, women just aren't as good at sports. And look, they're not as good at performing. They're not the Ariana Grande
No,
of
that's not what I was saying. But
hockey
anyway.
or badminton, like that. Like, we know that women are not less capable. I think everybody agrees on that. So we know there's cultural and societal structures which have been holding women back since the foundation of the state.
Okay, pause. Let me ask that.
Representatives
So first of all, when I say whose fault is that, women in Cork, no less than anywhere else, are 50% of the electorate, and they choose to elect 17 out of 18. At least they participate 50% in electing 17 out of the 18 TDs as men. And you say that men and women are equally capable, and I happen to agree. I think that's blindingly obvious. But would you accept that whether it's by interest and whether it's innate or whether it's something that's guided by society or a mixture of the two, that women and men tend to excel in different areas sometimes?
I don't think politics is an example of that. I think that when you say
no, I don't think it
whose
is.
fault is
You're
it,
right.
okay, so if we take politics as the example, then basically, I think the biggest problem in women getting elected in Ireland is the biggest parties. Sorry, the biggest parties is not accurate. The oldest parties.
Mm-hmm.
I say the biggest because I think of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, who have a massive problem.
We're in a new era now.
I remember, so like, it's very clear that the vast majority of people who are elected then are in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael historically, and they don't, include women in their parties, and that's well documented in terms of the facts. The Taoiseach at the moment, Micheál Martin, his party, 37 TDs, 5 of them are female. That's one more than my party, who only have 6 TDs.
Yeah.
Fine Gael struggle. And then, I was going to say big parties because they elect the vast majority of people in the country.
Yeah.
But the reality is that it exists within all of the old parties. So the Labour Party is the only other party that isn't that old. And that doesn't have one single female TD. So I don't think it's the electorate's fault. I think it's these organisations, these political parties that have an ingrained misogynistic culture that does not put women forward. We saw in the general election this blatant putting women on the ticket to meet the gender quota.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw a TD who was selected as the candidate who was going to get elected on the front page of a newspaper say, we're looking at these 2 other TDs to add to the ticket to, quote, tick the gender and geography box. That is not an attempt to get a woman elected.
Mm-hmm.
That is an attempt for a misogynistic party to have enough women on the ticket to meet their gender quota without making any real or meaningful attempt to get them elected.
Yeah, I
don't
agree.
for a second believe that women are less capable or men just happen to do better in politics.
Yeah,
I
agree.
Hold on. Problem.
Okay, yeah, I completely agree with you on that. And by the way, there was one party that was in danger of not meeting the gender balance quota at the other end. That was your party. You had so many female candidates. So I don't know whether I should say congratulations or whatever on that. But my point is that even in the far more gender equal days that we have now compared to, as you said, the time of your grandmother, if you look at some things that are more fine-grained, there are still enormous gender differences. For example, in the courses that male and female students take, they're highly gendered still. Why do you think that is?
I think, like that, men and women are different, and there's no uniformity around that. There's different levels of masculinity and femininity, I think, in everybody. And when we talk about gender equality, I mean that. I mean equality. I want women to be treated equally, not necessarily the same.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what I'm ever trying to say. And yeah, I think, a lot of that is, I think there's a lot of it is probably naturally what people fall into and are interested in. And then unfortunately, a lot of it, I think, is a result of those societal and cultural problems that we have as a result of our history and women being oppressed. So I think there's a combination of the two there. For example, women in science. I do think that we'll see a big rise in that as time goes on, that a lot of women are interested in it. But I met with a group, of STEM students recently who were talking about women in science and feeling really uncomfortable as the only woman in the classroom. that kind of thing. And you see that in politics as well. And it's a deterrent and it puts people off and it's a vicious cycle.
Yes, although there are now more females
than
males in universities in Ireland. But as I said, the choice, of course, is very gendered. And it really is striking that if you, as you mentioned, STEM is way more male. But even within that, for example, females who are in scientific courses are much more likely to be in things like biology. And do you think that there's something going on there that if you were to characterise university courses under two headings, one would be caring and the other being reading, and reading being things like law, literature, caring being things like medicine and biology and so forth related, that's where women really predominate. And then the things courses, engineering, computer science, are hugely male dominated. Clearly, in the past, there was discrimination against women in universities in that they weren't even allowed in previous centuries. But it doesn't really hold water to say that there's discrimination against women in the physics faculty, but not in the biology faculty, does it?
I think that there's two different things at play there. So for one, you're kind of talking about maybe an instinct being more prevalent in one gender versus the other, like maybe a caring one or a whatever that is. And I think that plays a part in it, in the kind of disproportionate amount of women, for example, in caring roles and stuff like that. Yeah. There's also the societal aspect of that, where that's expected of you as a woman, or something else is expected of you as a man. And I think we'd see less of it without those societal problems.
Are you sure?
And like you talk about, people were discriminated, or there was this discrimination in universities, but it's not there now. Like,
no, I didn't say that.
When there's that discrimination, it doesn't just disappear overnight then. For example,
that's true.
That's true.
Hold on, Holly, that's true.
Hang on. I'm going to do the same as you do to me when I'm talking. That, once we allow equal, marriage, once we allow gay people to marry, it doesn't mean that the shame and pain and stigma disappears overnight.
That's true. That's a good point.
We have better equality in
it
universities.
Fades away,
but
one would hope.
Pain, shame, and stigma isn't just gone because the rules have changed.
Yes, that's true, but it's curious that it's gone in the biology department and the medicine department and the law department, but it's not gone in the engineering department and the computer science department. That is curious, and that's true in every university pretty much in the Western world.
Yeah, it's very curious and something we need to look into, I suppose.
And
I'm a scientist. My little sister is finishing school at the moment, and she's going on to do chemistry. So I think you'll see a rise as time goes on,
Well, are you sure
like
of that?
Said, I think we can't underestimate.
I want to use international comparisons, because if you compare countries with relatively good education systems, one, Scandinavian countries, and two, the maybe South Asian Muslim-dominated countries, like Iran or Pakistan. And in Iran and Pakistan, you have a huge dominance of women in computer science and engineering. Whereas in Scandinavia, actually, as time goes on, the people are gravitating more and more to the gender stereotypical courses, so that in, for example, Norway, you are back to having overwhelmingly women in caring courses and so forth, and overwhelmingly males in engineering and computer science courses. And the proposed explanation of this is that in these very countries that are very restrictive for women, Pakistan or Iran or whatever, that in those countries girls will do anything to get out from under the thumb of their father and their brothers, and if that means going to doing an engineering course or a computer science course, that's fine, they'll get away and do that. Whereas where people have more freedom, they do seem to choose what seems to be more gender stereotypical courses.
It's fascinating, and everything you just said there, I think, just really proves the point that I was trying to make, and that is that the role of the society and the culture that you live in plays a very important role in how the two genders are, either one, and it can go both ways, maybe discouraged from certain parts of the sectors or different jobs, and then also encouraged. And it just goes to show how much society really plays an important role in that.
Sure, but that does suggest that there may be, and I'm not an expert in this, but that there may be a degree to which, for whatever natural reasons, it does seem that the effect of women gravitating more towards caring and more towards reading courses might not be the pressure of society, that when you're removing the pressure of society, that effect remains.
Based on the information that you're saying there, yeah. And then I suppose you can read other studies and different things that say different things. And I think, I think it's quite likely that women gravitate towards caring roles more than men, but it's certainly not exclusive to women. Like,
oh no, absolutely not.
Even so many different families and stuff. And I don't know how much these stereotypes and things really help, because it like we're talking a lot about women and women's rights, but like for men to maybe want to go into a caring role and feel like they can't is another aspect to that. So
sure, absolutely, I agree with that.
It's finding the perfect balance of the society that makes sure everybody feels comfortable to do those things. And,
absolutely.
I'm not an expert on that either.
No, but my point is then, and this is to try and bring that all together, is that if society is then to take a position to say that everything must be 50-50, that might be something that just doesn't fit with people.
But I don't know if anybody said every single thing should be 50-50. And like, if we're talking about quotas in different fields or whatever, I don't necessarily think that it should be 50-50 in every single sector. And like I said earlier, it's about equality. It's about being treated equally, not the same.
Holly Cairns, Social Democrat TD for Cork South West and spokesperson for Agriculture, Food, Marine and a whole load of other things. Thank you very much. Very enlightening discussion.
Thanks, William.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Holly Cairns at Holly Cairns TD. And get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. And thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. Their donations allow me to devote time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate €1 or €2 per podcast or per month, please do go to patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell, and by Kevin Wolf, if he's managed to get all these files from me and put it together into a podcast. Thank you for listening.